Welcome to Working with Interest in Business Math Basics. In this lesson, we're going to talk about how to compute interest both for earning and also for paying. And just a quick reminder, remember you can find additional resources and additional videos out on my website, luthermaddy.com. Interest is the cost of using somebody else's money. Now, you might be on the lending side where you're earning interest, or you might be on the borrowing side where you're paying interest. Now, when we're computing interest, we typically work with an annual percentage rate, APR, which of course is going to be using a percentage. Well, as I mentioned, you can either earn interest or you can pay interest. Now, if you have money to lend to the bank, you would put that money in an interest-bearing account and you would be earning interest. So again, interest is the cost of borrowing somebody else's money. Either you're on the receiving side of interest or you're on the paying side. Well, if I had to guess, I would guess that most of you who are viewing this video are either in or headed for a bookkeeping or an accounting class. So let's talk about a couple of terms that you're going to encounter in those classes. One is note and the other is loan. And we'll discuss these in detail as we continue on here. All right, let's talk about notes and loans just a little bit here. Notes are used by businesses and they're typically shorter term than a loan. A note might be a 30-day note, a 60-day note, 90-day, 120, 180. But what happens in a note, there's only one payment. At the end of the expiration period, the business has to pay back the amount they borrowed plus the interest all in just one payment. Now, a loan, on the other hand, is typically a longer term. You might have, for instance, a 3-year loan on your car or a 30-year mortgage on your house. And it's made up of monthly payments or periodic payments, typically monthly. And each month or with each payment, you're paying a certain amount in interest and a certain amount of that payment is paying off the principal. So after the term of the loan, the balance and all the interest is paid off. So again, notes, one payment, loan, multiple payments during the length of the loan. I just use a term. I want to make sure you understand the term is amortized. We see that term with loans, and all that means is it's made up of periodic payments until the loan is completely paid off. Part of the loan payment is interest and part is principal. All right, just another real quick review for these two terms, notes and loans. A corporate bond or a municipal bond would be considered a note, whereas a car loan, of course, or a mortgage would be considered a loan. Well, we're getting ready to do some math. When we're working with interest, we're going to be computing what our interest rate is or how much the interest should be. And so we're going to be using some formulas. And in these formulas, there are some terms that we need to make sure we understand. I've already talked about a couple of these, but let's talk about principal and time. Principal is the amount that we're borrowing. We designate that with P. Time is the length of the loan or how long the note is going to be. We designate that with a T. So P and T. P for principal, T for time. Again, because many of you will be taking a bookkeeping or an accounting class or are taking a class, we need to talk about how long a year is. Now, you don't have to be brilliant to realize that a year is 365 days. However, for accounting purposes, you might encounter a year that is only 360 days long. And that's just because when people were computing things by hand, they didn't have spreadsheets or calculators. It was a lot easier to work with a 360-day year than it was 365. And so we'll compute a couple of things based on both 365 and 360 days in a year. Well, it's time for our first formula. The first formula is to compute how much interest we're either paying or getting. And so we're going to represent interest with I. Of course, we talked about principal and time with a T. And the formula to compute interest is going to be the principal, P, times the interest rate, which we designate with an R, times the time. That will then equal the interest. And we'll show you how that works in the next slide. Well, here we go. We're going to find the amount of interest. So let's assume that we borrowed $1,000 at 10% for 60 days. So how much are we going to have to pay in interest? Well, we first have to determine whether we're using a 365-day year or a 360-day year. And unless you're a very large corporation, you're probably going to be using a 365-day year. But anyway, let's go ahead and start with a 360-day year. So the principal, P, is $1,000. The rate is 0.1. The time is 60 divided by 360 because we didn't borrow it for a whole year. we only borrowed it for 60 days out of the 360. So the interest using a 360-day year would be $16.67. Now, if we're using a 365-day year, the only thing that changes, of course, is the time. We have 60 divided by 365, and we'll be paying a little bit less interest because we're basing it on a 365-day year, less of a year that we've actually borrowed it. In that case, it's $16.44. All right, here's another example of finding the interest. Now, I just said that unless you're a large corporation, you probably won't be using notes. Well, here's an example of an individual that is using a note. Let's say you just borrowed some money from a friend or maybe a loan shark. Rather than having to pay monthly payments because it's just a short term, the friend says, hey, just pay it back at the end of, let's say, 90 days and pay me how much I lent you along with the interest. So we need to find out how much we have to pay our friend. So we borrowed $50 from our friend for 90 days, and he's going to charge us 9%. So we're going to assume in this case a 360-day year just to make it really simple. So our principal is 50, our interest rate annually is 0.09, and how long we're using it is only 90 of 360 days. So the interest in this case is $1.13. So we have to pay back the principal and the interest in just one payment because this is a note, and so we're going to owe our friend $51.13. Okay, we just showed you how to compute the amount of interest that you're going to pay for borrowing or be paid if you're the lender. Now we need to figure out how to find the principal if we know the other variables. So the formula to find out the principal is going to be I, which is the amount of interest, divided by the rate times the time. Well, let's go ahead and step through an example or two and make sure you understand how this works. Okay, again, what we're trying to do is figure out what the principal is. So here's our example. We paid $200 in interest for a 90-day note, and the rate was 10%. So we want to know how much we borrowed. Cost us $200 in interest, but how much did we actually borrow? So again, the formula is principal equals the interest rate divided by the rate times the time. So we have $200 in interest divided by zero point 0.1, which is the rate, times 90 days divided by 360, and of course that gives us $8,000. So we borrowed $8,000 for 90 days at 10%, and it cost us $200 in interest. And again, because this is a note, which is what you'll commonly run into in your accounting and bookkeeping classes, we're using a 360-day year for a note. All right, let's go through a couple more formulas, then we'll start with some real life examples here. So sometimes you know how much you paid in interest, the actual interest amount, but you want to know what the rate was that you actually paid. So in that case, the formula for rate is going to be the interest amount that you paid divided by the rate times the time. Let's go ahead and see how that works. Okay, here's an example of finding the interest rate. We paid $200 in interest when we borrowed $2,000 for 1 year. So we want to know what the actual rate was that the individual or the bank charged us. So again, the formula is the rate equals the amount of interest divided by the principal times the time. So we have $200 in interest divided by $2,000 times 1. It was just exactly 1 year. And that equates to 10% interest. All right, here's another formula. Sometimes we need to find the time. So if we know the interest amount that we paid, we know the interest rate and the amount we borrowed, we might need to know, well, how long did we actually borrow that money for to end up paying as much interest as we did? So the formula to compute the time is the interest amount divided by the principal times the rate. All right, so here's an example of trying to find out how long we borrowed the money for. We know that we paid $200 in interest and we borrowed $2,000 and we had an interest rate of 12%. Well, the formula to compute the time is the amount that we paid in interest divided by the principal times the rate. Now remember, there's two different year formats, 360 days or 365. So we're going to end up with two different answers here. So we take the $200 in interest, we divide that by 2,000 times the rate of 0.12, 0.12, and we end up with 0.8333, a portion of a year. Well, using 360-day year, the 0.8333 of that year is 300 days, and if we're using a 365-day year, 0.88 excuse me, 8333 of 365 is 304 days. So that's how you find the time. Well, let's go over a few real life examples to hopefully put all this together and see how these formulas can actually be helpful. So here's one example. ACE check cashing will cash post-dated checks. In other words, we post it out, we date it for after we actually write the check. So they're going to hold our check for 2 weeks and they're only going to charge us 5% for that. So we want to know what the actual interest rate is that they're actually charging if they're charging 5% to hold our check for 2 weeks. Well, to solve the interest rate that the ACE check cashing company is charging us, we really don't use any of the formulas that we've looked at here, just kind of a variation. So we know in this case that they're charging us 5% for 2 weeks. Well, 2 weeks is only 2 50-seconds of a year. So we take 0.05 and we divided that by 2 divided by 52 equals 1.3. So they're being so nice and generous to hold our check for 2 weeks and only charge us 5%, but that comes out to an annual percentage rate of 130%. Well, let's try another real life example applying what we've learned about interest so far. So assume that we owe $5,200 on a credit card and the credit card company charges us 29% interest. Now that's a horrible amount, but that's a whole lot better than the check cashing company we used a minute ago. So our minimum payment is $135. So we want to know how much of that payment is applied to principal, paying off what we owe, and how much goes to interest. Okay, so remember we have a $5,200 credit card balance, we have a 29% interest rate that they charge us, and we made a monthly payment, minimum payment of $135. So 1 month's interest, so 5,200 times 0.29 divided by 12, again will get us 1 month's interest. We're paying $125.67 in interest for that month. And so of that $135 payment, we subtract the 125 and 0.67 in interest. We have $9.33 applied to the principal. It's going to take us literally forever to pay off that credit card, which is why you don't want to make just the minimum payments on your credit cards. Well, that concludes our Working with Interest lesson in Business Math Basics. Please watch for additional videos. I'll be doing some accounting and some bookkeeping videos. Hopefully this provided some good information for you as you're progressing along in your business math class. If you like this video, please like it. If you don't like it, well, I guess you could send me a comment, or yeah, you can even say I don't like it. Please consider subscribing, and I appreciate you watching all my videos. Remember, you can download additional resources, some printed handouts on my website, luthermaddy.com.